Welcome to the Arabesque Sewing Studio. I'm Ali Phillips, and in this video we're going to be making the Cottage Table Square Coaster. Now this is the first in a series of 3 free coaster patterns that gently step you up in skill level and technique as you sew each one. Each one introduces new sewing terms and techniques that are explained simply and clearly, so you can sew along with me and feel confident and supported every step of the way. I'll also be guiding you through how to read a sewing pattern so you can grow your functional sewing literacy as you go. So if this is your very first sewing project, then this project is for you. And if you've already made a few projects but you're still feeling a little unsure and overwhelmed, this is going to help you grow in your confidence and move forward. By the end of this video, you will be holding in your hands your very first sewing project, and you will have crossed the line from merely standing on the sidelines watching others sew to becoming a sewist yourself. Now, I truly believe that sewing makes the most sense when we can create something functional and useful, and the Cottage Table Coasters do exactly that. You can put a little touch of your own personality in every room of your home. I've sewn this one in cottagecore vibes, but you can add your own personality and flair and use whatever fabric you would like. And yes, this is a free pattern, so you can grab yours by following the link in the description below. Now, if you love educational sewing videos that help you grow in your skills and your confidence, I'd love you to give this video a like and hit that subscribe button. So if you're ready to give this project a go, grab a copy of your pattern and your supplies and we'll get started. So let's have a closer look at the project we're going to be sewing today. Now, many people never even think about the construction process or how something is put together, but sewists do. So most sewing projects are actually sewn inside out and then turned right side out at the end. So this can be tricky to visualize at first, but this project is a great introduction to that technique. So this square cottage table coaster is made up of 2 layers of fabric. So we have one on the front and one on the back, and inside we have a layer of batting or fusible fleece. So the layer of padding in this project gives this a beautiful padded and lofty look, gives it some softness, and that's also going to help protect your furniture as you're using this. It's going to help absorb any condensation and protect any fragile furniture from hot drinks. So if you haven't gone and grabbed a copy of your free pattern, go ahead and download that now and print it out. So when you first open a pattern, please don't rush in and just get started with your scissors straight away. It's so important to read right through the pattern first, even if that feels like a lot of work, because you're going to be getting a big picture overview of the steps and processes that are involved. And if you don't understand anything straight away, just jot down a few notes, just read right through, take some notes, and then come back and read through it a second time. And you'll be amazed at how much everything clicks the second time, because your brain will have built some sewing literacy as you've gone through. You'll have some little hooks to hang that information on, and you're just going to understand everything so much better. Now, a sewing project is made up of smaller parts called pattern pieces, and each one of these pieces has its own name, like the front and the back. So these names are your landmarks. They're going to help you identify what each piece is and understand where it fits in the final project. And it's going to help you follow your instructions step by step, because you're going to know what each piece is referring to. So take the time to familiarize yourself with what each pattern piece is called so that you'll understand what it's referring to when you come to those instructions. Now, the great thing about sewing is that you don't need a lot of supplies to get started with a very simple project. So many of these supplies you're likely to find already lying around your house. If you've got a basic sewing kit, then you're going to have some of these sewing supplies already. So let's run through the things that I recommend you start with for sewing this project. Now, you're going to need a basic sewing machine. So I haven't shown that here, but that goes without saying. We're going to be sewing this on the sewing machine. Now, I do recommend that you have an iron and an ironing board or a pressing station. This is going to be really important when it comes to getting a nice shape to our coaster. Now I do recommend that you start with 3 pairs of scissors here. So this is my top favorite for how to cut things out. So when I'm going to be cutting out fabric, I like to start with a nice sharp pair of shears. So these are scissors that have longer blades, and they're going to really help you cut something out nice and straight and give a really great level of accuracy when you're cutting out. Then I recommend that you have a smaller pair of sharp pointy scissors, and these are for trimming threads at the sewing machine and doing any other fine seam trimming that we'll be doing later on. So these have shorter blades, and shorter blades just give you a lot more control so that when you're doing fine work, you're less likely to slip. And lastly, I have a pair of regular scissors just for cutting out paper. So I use these for cutting out my templates. I make sure to never touch paper with my fabric scissors because they will get blunt very quickly. Now you're going to need some kind of pen for marking your fabric. So you can use a regular old biro if you're going to be marking on the back side of your fabric. This is perfectly fine. You can also use a friction pen. This is another pen that works really well because it disappears with heat. And if you have got something fancier, you could try an actual fabric marking pen like chalk, or a pen that disappears with water when you apply it. But you don't need to start with anything very special, just a regular old pen will do. I recommend that you have some basic pins for pinning your layers of fabric together, and also a ruler or a tape measure for marking distances on your fabric. Now, one non-traditional technique that I'd like to teach you here today is how amazing glue is. So I use glue in my projects all the time, and this is a great way to close openings and to base things in place. So I recommend that you get yourself a glue stick. This is just a regular school glue stick. And I also have some tacky craft glue, and this is just a very sticky PVA type glue that dries really quickly. And I have this in a syringe type dispenser here that dispenses just a really tiny amount of glue. So this is just an optional extra that you can have. Now I do recommend that you have a seam ripper or quick unpick on hand. This is just part of learning to sew and becoming accurate with what you're doing. Every now and again you're going to need to rip out some stitches. And of course you're going to need some regular thread. This can be cotton or polyester. And ideally it's going to match your project and blend in with the colours that you've got. And one more thing I forgot to get out. I've got a knitting needle here, or a point turner, and this is for poking out the corners on your coaster and just making sure that you've got nice pointy corners. So let's run over the materials that I'm going to be using today. So I have one fabric for the front and one for the back, and these coordinate really nicely together. But they also mean that I can have a completely different look on the front and the back of the coaster, depending on which side is facing up. Now inside the coaster, I've got a layer of padding. So this can be a layer of batting, or it can be a layer of fusible fleece. And fusible fleece is just batting that has a layer of glue on the back of it that you can fuse into place with your iron so that it sticks to your fabric. So either one of these is perfectly fine. I'll be showing you how to use both of these. So now we're going to start preparing the pieces that we need to make this coaster. So at the end of your pattern, you're going to find some templates. So these are the pattern pieces that we're going to use to prepare the pieces of the coaster. Now, when you print this out, it's very important to make sure your printer is set to 100% so that it's going to print out at the right size. And after you've printed, take your ruler and check this scale square that we have down here. Check that this measures exactly 1 inch by 1 inch. That's going to tell you that your pieces are the right size. Now grab your paper scissors, and we're going to cut these out by cutting exactly on the line with nice even strokes, not shutting our scissors as we're going. We're going to make sure that we don't have any jagged cuts on here, and when you cut off the edge of the paper, then you can shut your scissors. So So continue all the way around until you've cut your templates out. So go ahead and cut out your fabric template and your batting template. Now before we trace anything onto our fabric, it's really important to press everything flat. So this is going to remove any large folds or creases that could be giving you warping or distortion as you trace and cut. So just hold your iron on your fabric and move it all around so we're not pushing the fabric or stretching it, giving it a nice firm pressure until we can see all of those creases have disappeared. Now if you've got fabric that's been folded for a really long time, you might need to give it a little spritz of water or maybe even some starch, but water usually does the trick really well. I'm also using a little bit of steam with mine, which just helps relax all the fibres a little bit more. Now I'd like you to see here that the finished coaster and the template are not the same size. So if I lay that on here, you'll see that the template is actually larger than the finished piece. And this is because of the seam allowance. So the seam allowance is a border of fabric around the edge that gets sewn into the seams. So this is the space between the line of stitching and the edge of the fabric. This is what lets us join pieces together. And for this project, the seam allowance width is 1/4 inch. So I want you to notice when you look at your fabric that it's got two different sides on it. So one side is going to be very bright and pretty. You'll be able to see the design nice and clearly. On the back, you're likely going to have a very different look. So the design is going to be very pale or white, or you might not be able to see it at all. So this is called the wrong side of the fabric, and the front where you can see everything clearly is called the right side of the fabric. So this is the side that faces outwards in the project. Now you might have a solid fabric like this linen here that looks the same on both sides, and in that case you're going to pick one side to be your right side and one side to be your wrong side, and you're going to follow the directions in the pattern like that. So to get started tracing the templates, I want you to lay these fabrics so that the wrong side is facing up and the pretty side or the right side is down. Then we're going to take the square coaster and we're going to choose one of these to be our front and one of these to be our back. I'm going to lay this on the center of the fabric, and holding it firmly in place, I'm going to trace right around the edge of the template. Now I keep my finger quite close to where my pen is so that I can support the edge of that template. But as I move my fingers, I make sure that I'm keeping constant pressure in the center of the template so that it's not going to move. And repeat this for the second shape. Now the great thing about using templates here today means that you don't have to measure anything, and you don't have to worry about getting everything nice and square because you've got a nice shape to trace around. So now you're going to take your fusible fleece, place it so that the glue side or the bumpy side is facing down, and center your batting template in the center. So once again, you're going to just hold your fingers close to the edge of this template and work your way around. Now we cut this layer of padding smaller so that it stays out of the seam allowance and gives you a much flatter and smoother finish to the edges of your coaster. So now we're going to cut out each of these pieces using our large fabric scissors. So cutting fabric is quite different from cutting paper because fabric likes to warp and stretch as you cut it. So the way to get a nice controlled cut is to open your scissors quite wide, and then as you cut, only close them part way to avoid getting a jagged cut. And this just helps you keep a lot of control over what you're doing. So take your time as you go. We're going to cut right on top of this line here. I like to put my hand right next to where I'm cutting. and then just take smooth, slow cuts, and then you can close your scissors as you cut off the edge. So then turn your fabric, keep your left hand on the fabric close to where you're cutting, and take slow, smooth cuts. Okay, so there's one piece cut out. So then I'm going to move on to the second piece of fabric. And then we're going to move on to cutting out the batting or the fusible fleece. Now here's a little organisational tip that I like to use. So when you have your pieces cut out, a really great way to keep track of which piece is which is to pin the template onto the front of the piece. Now when you have a very simple project that only has 2 or 3 pieces, a step like this isn't super necessary. But when you're sewing a complex pattern with many pieces, getting in this organisational habit is just a great game changer so that you don't lose your pieces or get them mixed up. So now we're going to add the internal layer of padding that's going to give your coaster thickness and softness. So take the fabric that's going to be your front, and we're going to lay this wrong side up and right side down. And then we're going to take the fusible fleece and we're going to lay this so that the glue side is facing down. And we're going to center this exactly in the center of that piece of fabric. So then I'm going to grab a scrap piece of fabric, or you can even just grab the remaining back piece of fabric here, and I'm going to lay this on top of the fleece. And the reason that we need a pressing cloth to fuse this in place is because this is a polyester product and it doesn't take well to direct heat. So we want an extra layer in between, and when we put this on, we want to just make sure that we're not shifting this layer of fleece. So then I'm going to take the iron and I'm going to just place it directly down onto the fabric, and I'm going to give it a little bit of steam and hold it there for a few seconds at a time. And every time I want to pick it up and move it, I want to lift and then place it down and give it a bit of pressure again. So I don't want to be pushing as I go, because that's going to shift the fleece so that it's not in the center. So now I just want to check that this has stuck and fused well. And if you find any parts are still lifting up, so this corner needs a little bit extra, just put your cloth back in place and give it a little bit more pressing with the iron. Okay, so I can see that's all nicely firmly fused now. So now I'm going to show you how to do this with a piece of batting. So once more, you're going to lay your fabric so that it's right side down, wrong side up. And we're going to lay the batting in the center of the fabric. Make sure that the seam allowance is even all around. And then I'm just going to lift up part of this at a time and just give a few swipes of my glue stick just to get enough glue on there just to make this a little bit tacky. Then lay that out. Then I'm going to flip that around and do the same for the other side. So I'm not putting the glue in the seam allowance, I'm keeping this underneath where the batting will be. So glue basting is a technique where we use glue to hold the layers in place before we sew them together. Now, because we're going to be sewing this project inside out, we need to mark an opening for turning this right side out at the end. So now I want you to take your ruler, your tape measure, and we're going to mark a 2-inch opening in the center of one of the edges. So now this is going to be our turning gap, and a turning gap is an unsewn space left in a seam so that you can turn your project right side out after you've sewn it. So now we're going to pin these layers together. So you need to take your back piece and lay it so that it's wrong side down, right side up, and then lay your front piece on top so the right sides of the fabric are together and the batting is on top. So make sure that the raw edges of both of these pieces are lining up precisely. So the raw edge on the fabric is the cut part of the fabric that can fray. So now we're going to pin these layers together. So I'm going to pop a couple of pins into each of the sides of the coaster. So you can do this by pointing your pins out towards the raw edge, or you can do this by pointing your pins in towards the middle of the project. Either way is acceptable. So I'm going to push all the way down through those layers and then pinch them together and poke the pin back up to the top. Now as you go, make sure you stop and check that your layers are staying together nicely. So if you can see that things are shifting, take the time to take that pin out again and put it in again until you're happy with how everything is sitting together. So pinning is a very important step when you're learning to sew, because it's going to stop those layers from shifting and keeps them anchored together so that you can have a much more precise finish at the end. So now we're ready to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch right around the edge of this coaster except across this opening that we've marked. So you're going to thread your machine with the thread colour that you've chosen, and we're going to set the stitch length to about 2.5 millimeters. And this is just a great all-round stitching length for a construction seam. And then we're going to sew at 1/4 inch seam allowance around the edge. So there's 3 ways you can guide your stitching so that it's straight and your seam allowance stays even. So one way is to trace the batting template again to draw your stitching line. So then you would just take your batting coaster, place it over the top again and retrace that stitching line. The second way that you can sew straight and even is to follow along the very edge of the batting and use that as your guide for your stitching line. And the third way that you can sew is to follow the 1/4 inch guide on your sewing machine's needle plate, or use a 1/4 inch foot and follow the edge of that. Either one of these options will get you a great result. So we're going to start stitching at the bottom of this turning opening. We're going to sew forward a few stitches, and then we're going to reverse and go back to the beginning before we continue sewing forward again. So this is known as backstitching, and this is very important for locking those beginning stitches down so that they don't come undone when they're put under pressure. So then we're going to continue sewing until we get to this corner, and then we're going to stop with the needle down, lift up the presser foot and turn the work 90 degrees, put the presser foot back down again, and then continue sewing along this seam until we get to the next corner, where once again we'll stop with the needle down, lift up the presser foot, turn the work, put the presser foot down and continue sewing. Now as we come up to the top of the turning opening, we're going to stop on this mark, we're going to backstitch, and then we're going to cut the thread, and this will lock in those stitches at the beginning of the turning opening as well. So let's take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to run through this all again with you as we're sewing. So we're going to start stitching at the bottom of this turning opening. We're going to sew forward a few stitches, and then we're going to reverse and go back to the beginning before we continue sewing forward again. So then we're going to continue sewing until we get to this corner, and then we're going to stop with the needle down, lift up the presser foot and turn the work 90 degrees, put the presser foot back down again, and then continue sewing along this seam until we get to the next corner. Where once again we'll stop with the needle down, lift up the presser foot, turn the work, put the presser foot down and continue sewing. we'll continue until we get back to the last side. Now as we come up to the top of the turning opening, we're going to stop on this mark, we're going to backstitch, and then we're going to cut the thread, and this will lock in those stitches at the beginning of the turning opening as well. So now our coaster is sewn together, and the next step is to trim off the corners on the diagonal close to the stitching line, and this is going to remove the extra fabric bulk that can stop your corner being nice and pointy. So with your small scissors, you're going to trim nice and close to the stitching line, but not through it. Just trim off that corner on the 45 degrees. So now we're ready to turn the project right side out through the opening that we've left here. So just separate the layers and then start pushing and pulling all of that fabric so that it comes out through the hole. Now this is a fiddly procedure. We've got a small hole here and we've got a lot of bulky fabric to fit through the hole. So we want to do this nice and slowly, and we don't want to be tugging on that opening so that we pop the stitches on the sides of the opening. So just take your time working your way through this. And it won't be too long before you suddenly feel that everything has come through that opening. And now you just need to reach your finger in that hole and start pushing all of those layers apart and pushing those seam edges right up to the edges of the coaster. So do your best to reach into the corners and just push them out. They won't be super pointy at this stage, and that's okay. I'm just going to start the process. Okay, so here's where you get your first look at how your finished coaster is going to look. Hopefully you've got the right side of the fabric on the outside, and you've got that batting or fusible fleece on the inside. So now we're going to reach inside with our knitting needle or point turner, and we're just going to work our way into those corners and just gently but firmly give them a bit of coaxing to push out so that they can become pointy. So taking the time to get a nice pointy corner really does help define your work and help it look a lot more professional. So don't push too hard, or you could accidentally push through the stitching and make a hole in your work. It's just slowly and gently until you're happy with the shape. So right now your coaster is probably looking quite crumpled and misshapen, and that's okay. That's the way they always look when you turn something right side out and it's been screwed up quite a bit. So now we're going to bring in the magic of pressing. So pressing transforms all that soft rumpled fabric into something crisp, square, and very beautiful. So even before we start pressing with an iron, you can do quite a bit of shaping just with your fingers and your fingernails. So I like to roll those seams between my fingers and just try and get all those edges nice and opened out. And what I'm aiming for here, I want that seam sitting right on the edge. Now I've also got an opening here, and what I want to do is tuck those raw edges back inside the opening, and I want to work at getting this edge nice and straight so that you can't see where that opening has been. So when I'm reasonably happy with how flat the seams are sitting, then I'm going to take my iron and start giving this some steam and just working my way around the coaster and setting that nice and flat. So the magic of pressing is that while the fibres are quite warm and hot, they're very flexible, and you can do quite a bit more shaping while everything is hot. So I like to keep working my way around with my fingernails, scraping everything, getting those seams exactly where I would like them. So press it from both sides and get all those creases out, and you can start to see the beautiful shape that transforms from that rumpled mess into a beautifully crisp, straight, square edge. So now I'm going to take my tacky craft glue and I'm going to glue baste this side turning opening closed. So I'm just running a very small narrow bead of glue in that seam allowance and pushing those edges back into place. And then I'm going to set that dry with the iron. So now that edge is sealed really, really well, and you would never know that that was there. So unless you actively try and pull that apart, that is never going to come apart again. So now we're going to take this coaster back to the sewing machine and we're going to do the final step, which is to add a row of top stitching. So top stitching is a visible row of stitching sewn on the outside of a project. It's often decorative, but it also helps to reinforce a seam and keep the layers flat. So to sew this row of top stitching, you can use the 1/4 inch guide on your sewing machine plate and follow along the edge of that. Or you can take your ruler and you can mark the stitching line so that you have a nice clear line to follow. Now this is something that I still do when I am trying to stitch nice and straight. I will mark the stitching line. So now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm going to set my stitch length to quite a bit longer now. I'm going to set it to about 3.2 millimeters. So using a slightly longer stitch length makes it a lot easier to sew straight and also adds a really refined look to your project. So we're going to sew right around the edge on this line. We're going to pivot at the corners and we're going to back stitch when we get to the end to lock those stitches in place. So here we have the final coaster. I'm going to give it a little press from both sides and then just check that I've got all my ends trimmed and any lint removed. So you give it a bit of a brush, you can roll it with a fabric roller, and then that coaster is done. You can put it to work, put some drinks on it and admire all your beautiful handiwork. So congratulations, if you sewed along with me and made your first coaster, you've done an amazing job. Well done. You've officially crossed the line to becoming a sewist. So don't forget, this is just the beginning. There are 2 more coaster patterns to come that will gently step you up in skills and techniques. So if you have a friend who would love to start their sewing journey, I'd love you to share this video with them. Thanks for sewing along with me and for joining me in the Arabesque studio today. Happy sewing, and I'll see you in the next video.